On an autumn night in 1994, in a small town called Maple Creek, I, Lucas, then 10 years old, had a strange experience that still sends chills down my spine every time I think about it. That year, Halloween fell on a Saturday, and as usual, my mother took me to my best friend Max's house, so we could go trick-or-treating together. Max lived a few blocks away, and it was the first time I got to go out on my own with friends, without any adults accompanying us. Max was a friend since kindergarten, a year older than me. Max and another friend, Eric, who was also older, were people I admired. They were always leading in all games, and I often followed their plans. However, this time was different. Max's parents were not home. Only his older brother, Natalie, about 19 years old, was home and responsible for looking after him. Natalie was quite aloof and hardly ever paid attention to us whenever I visited Max. He was always busy with his girlfriend, and Max seemed very comfortable doing things freely without supervision. That evening, we eagerly prepared large cloth bags to go trick-or-treating. I had expected Natalie to go with us, but it turned out no one did. Max and Eric assured me that there was nothing to worry about and that they knew the streets better than I did. So, we began our Halloween adventure, excited. Maple Creek was a small, quiet, and quaint town with Victorian-style houses lined along the main road. It was a town where everyone knew each other, but on Halloween night, when darkness fell, something made the town feel unfamiliar. We wandered from house to house, knocking on doors and shouting, "Trick or treat." The adults laughed, gave us candy, and after a few hours, our bags were overflowing. But instead of heading back home, Max came up with a bold idea. He wanted to go deeper into the western part of town, a place we rarely ventured into. It was an area near some abandoned houses where few people passed by. I felt a bit uneasy, but Eric and Max laughed at my fear, so I followed them. The area was entirely different from the rest of the town. The houses were dark, with no Halloween decorations, and there were no sounds of laughing children. As we ventured further, a heavy atmosphere surrounded us. We decided to knock on a few doors, but no one answered. A sense of unease started to rise in me, and I began thinking about turning back. But just then, we saw a woman. She was standing under a dim streetlight, pushing an old stroller. From a distance, she looked like a mother taking her child out for a late walk. Max, with his insatiable curiosity, decided to approach her. As we got closer, she turned and said in a low voice, "Hello boys, have you gotten a lot of candy?" Max cheerfully responded, "A lot, and you?" The woman smiled faintly. "Oh, I have plenty of candy. I can give you the rest if you'd like." Eric's eyes immediately lit up, and he asked, "What do you have?" The woman pointed to the bag hanging on the stroller handle, saying that she had many kinds of candy that her son hadn't finished. She pointed to the stroller, saying that the boy was asleep, and she didn't want to wake him up. All three of us looked at each other. Max, being curious, asked her where she lived. The woman pointed to an old house at the end of the street, where no lights were on, and said, "I live right there. If you follow me, I'll give you all the remaining candy." Although a bit hesitant, Max and Eric couldn't resist the tempting offer, and they dragged me along with the woman. I couldn't deny that part of me hoped she was just a kind woman who wanted to give us candy. But the eerie feeling clung to me as we approached the dark house. The house looked as if it had been abandoned for a long time. The windows were dusty, and the porch light didn't work. The woman opened the front door and pushed the stroller inside. She turned back, inviting us in, and said, "Wait a moment, I'll get the candy for you." Max and Eric quickly stepped inside, but I stopped at the door, feeling uncomfortable. I asked, "Can we leave the door open?" The woman paused, then nodded. Of course. I started to feel that something was very wrong. The inside of the house was dark and cold. Max approached the stroller, curious to see the sleeping baby. He lifted the cover and suddenly froze. I saw his face turn pale. Without saying a word, Max quickly turned around and ran outside, pulling me along. Eric, confused, looked on, but after seeing Max panic, he followed suit. We ran like crazy down the empty street, not stopping until we saw the lights from other houses. When we finally stopped, Max was panting in the stroller. There was no baby. Something was wrong. Just then, an elderly man from a nearby house stepped out and looked at us with a stern expression. He asked, "Do you know that woman?" Max explained everything while Eric and I listened silently. The man frowned and said, "She doesn't have a child. I've seen her wandering around here all evening." He offered to take us home, and we immediately agreed. When I got home, I told my mother everything. She listened, then immediately called the police to report the woman. My parents never told me exactly what happened after that, but I knew they wanted to protect me from anything worse that could have happened. After that night, my mother never let me go trick-or-treating without an adult again. Max and I still played together, but the memory of that Halloween night has always been a haunting mark in my mind. On a cold November night in 2019, on the outskirts of the small town of Ravenwood, I was 22 years old at the time, tasked with staying home to watch over the house while my parents were away. My mother had prepared a large batch of cakes, cookies, and candy for the Halloween party she planned to host that weekend. I knew for sure that after the party, we'd have a lot of leftover sweets that no one would finish, and I'd reluctantly have to eat them for weeks, completely ruining my diet plans. My house was located at the end of a quiet road in a fairly new and remote neighborhood, so during holidays like Halloween, few people came by. Although Halloween had passed earlier in the week, this weekend was still when many people held late parties. The weather had begun to turn cold, and the town of Ravenswood was gradually entering winter. With a flexible college schedule, I spent that morning playing basketball and doing some assignments on my laptop. That night, I planned to relax and watch a few of my favorite horror movies. After dinner, I went up to my room, selected The Haunting of Hill House on Netflix, and had just been watching for a few minutes when suddenly the doorbell rang. It was close to 10 p.m. A mix of surprise and worry hit me, because at that time, it was rare for anyone to visit. My house was at the end of the street, surrounded by woods, with very few neighbors. I stopped the movie, went downstairs, and opened the door. Standing in front of me was a tall man dressed in a ragged Santa Claus outfit, completely out of place for the winter season. The strange thing was the terrifying mask he wore, which did not match the Santa costume at all. From his build, I could tell he was an older man. The man didn't say a word, just stood there awkwardly, waving at me. He pointed to a large black bag he was holding, as if asking me for something. Instead of opening the glass door, I just stood behind it and said, "Sorry, we don't have anything to give right now," before slamming the door shut. My heart raced, and I felt foolish for opening the door so late at night. I stood still by the door, trying to listen to see if the man had left, but I heard no footsteps. Then, the doorbell rang again. This time, fear crept into my mind. I couldn't understand why the man was still there, continuing to ring the bell. I didn't open the door again, just stood in silence, hoping he would leave. But then I heard the sound of the glass door being hit hard, as if someone was trying to force it open. A loud noise followed, like the lock being broken. The sound of the door handle turning made me feel like the situation was getting worse. Immediately, I ran upstairs to my room, shut the door, and locked it tight. I grabbed my phone to text my parents, but neither of them responded. Fear overwhelmed me, and I couldn't think of anything reasonable to do. In that moment, I tried to convince myself that this was just someone's prank. But then, another sound came from outside. I heard soft footsteps downstairs, and the scraping sound of something dragging along the walls of the house. The noise grew louder and seemed to be coming from just outside my bedroom window. My room was on the second floor, and I wondered how anyone could be standing outside my window. With curiosity, I cautiously stepped closer to the window, pulled the curtains aside, and there he was, the man in the terrifying Santa outfit. His grotesque mask was clearly visible through the glass. He tilted his head, staring at me, completely still. I screamed in terror and can't remember what happened next. All I recall is grabbing my phone, running out of my room, and heading straight to my parents' bedroom. I locked the door and shakily called 911. My voice trembled as I recounted the incident to the dispatcher. Every time I heard a sound from outside the room, I anxiously asked when the police would arrive. The dispatcher kept reassuring me that officers were on their way. The police arrived within 15 minutes, but to me, it felt like an eternity. When they checked around the house, they found the front door lock had been broken, and on the ground, just below my bedroom window, was an old ladder. The man had gone into the backyard shed and found the ladder to climb up to my window. After the police left, I couldn't stay in the house alone anymore. I called my best friend, Jake, and decided to stay over at his place for the night. Even though I was safe, the feeling of unease never left me. To this day, I still don't know if it was just a crazy prank, or if something terrible had almost happened. All I know is that I was lucky to have noticed in time and acted quickly. It was a chilly autumn evening in early November 2018, with Halloween already behind us, but the festive atmosphere still lingered throughout the town. My close friends, Sarah, Leah, and Jane, and I were still searching for a late-night party to join, as all the big Halloween events had already passed. The excitement still lingered, and we wanted to make the most of the last chance to wear our fun costumes. However, all the major parties in the area had either been cancelled or sold out early. We were all gathered at Jane's house, sitting on the couch, chatting, and doing our makeup. We didn't have any specific plans, and that filled the air with anticipation. Sarah, always confident and quick to act, decided to post a status on Facebook and a story on Snapchat, asking if anyone knew of a party. While I didn't object, I couldn't deny that I felt it was a bit bold, maybe even embarrassing. But Sarah wasn't the shy type, and she always seemed to know how to connect with people. So, I wasn't surprised when she got a response in about 10 minutes. Sarah turned to us with an excited smile and said, "There's a party tonight." Brian texted me. Brian was someone we knew, not very close, but he seemed to have a good grasp of the underground events in town. Sarah shared the details Brian sent. The address was on the outskirts of Riverwood, about a 20-minute drive from where we were, a place none of us had ever been. Brian mentioned it was a small, private party, and a few familiar faces from our circle would be attending. After some thought, we decided to give it a try. We all felt a little excited and curious about this mysterious party, though something in the air made me feel slightly uneasy. Leah, being more cautious, raised a few questions about the location, but Sarah reassured us that it was a familiar party and there was nothing to worry about. So, after getting ready, we called an Uber and brought a few drinks. Leah had some beer, Jane brought a few cans of Budweiser, and I carried a small bottle of vodka. Sarah didn't bring anything because she liked trying the drinks at parties. As we approached the house mentioned, I could feel the isolation and coldness of the place. The large house sat in the middle of the woods, far from any other homes, and that gave the whole area an eerie vibe. As soon as the Uber stopped, I looked around the large house. It was dimly lit by a few weak lights, casting a gloomy atmosphere. Flickering orange lights came from inside, making the house feel like a haunted one. I felt a little uneasy, but Sarah and Jane seemed so excited that I told myself I was probably just imagining things. As we stepped inside, the first thing I noticed was that the atmosphere didn't resemble any parties I had been to. The living room was crowded, but no one looked familiar. The dim lighting from the wall sconces created an uncomfortable vibe. Sarah texted Brian to ask if he had arrived, but there was no response. In the meantime, an older man approached us. He looked around 45, wearing an old shirt and slacks, completely out of place for a Halloween party. He smiled warmly and introduced himself as Charles, the owner of the house. Charles welcomed us and invited us to the kitchen to put our drinks in the cooler. The kitchen was dim, with only a few weak lights hanging from the ceiling. The coolers were already filled with drinks. But what was odd was that most of the brands were unfamiliar. None of us recognized them. Charles seemed eager to offer us more drinks. He wandered around chatting with everyone, but he lingered a bit longer when talking to the girls. This made me a little uneasy, but Leah reassured me it was just his way of being overly friendly. We then decided to try playing beer pong at a nearby table. A few guys started chatting with us, and although we didn't know them, the atmosphere temporarily felt more relaxed. I plugged my phone into an outlet to charge, as it was down to about 20%, then returned to the game. Midway through, Charles returned with drinks for the group. He handed Sarah and me each a cocktail, and Leah and Jane received 2 other drinks. All were in red Solo cups. I took a sip of the vodka soda and noticed it tasted off. I drank slowly, feeling uneasy. After a short while, when the game ended, I returned to where I had left my phone and realized it hadn't charged at all. I tried plugging it into another outlet, but still no signal. A sense of unease rose in me, so I texted Sarah to ask if she noticed anything strange. Sarah replied that she also felt uncomfortable, but told me not to worry. We continued chatting and playing a few more games, but the atmosphere seemed to grow more bizarre. I started to feel dizzy and my vision blurred. My head felt numb, and it seemed like I couldn't stay alert anymore. I tried texting Sarah that I wasn't feeling well, but the message wouldn't send. The next thing I remember is everything going black. When I woke up, I realized I was sitting in a car. Sarah was driving and Leah was in the passenger seat. Jane sat in the back, looking unwell. I asked what had happened, and Sarah said we had decided to leave when things got too weird. Charles had started acting overly familiar, even trying to hold on to me as I was losing consciousness. Sarah and Leah had become worried and decided to get us out immediately. I checked my phone and found a series of messages from an unknown number. The first one said I looked beautiful that night. After that, there were a string of lewd and threatening messages. Even more terrifying, one of the texts said they knew where I lived and would see me soon. Fear gripped me, and I couldn't find the words to speak. We immediately decided to go to the nearest police station to report the incident. When we recounted everything to the police, they seemed very concerned and asked us about the house where the party took place. When we mentioned the address, the police suddenly became serious. They said the house had actually been abandoned for months. No one lived there. This revelation shocked us all. We detailed everything, including receiving texts from the unknown number and the strange situation at the party. The police took down the information and promised to investigate the strange phone number further. However, even as we left the station, the feeling of unease lingered. Sarah mentioned that she, too, had received a few odd messages from the number but hadn't paid attention, thinking they were spam. I immediately blocked the unknown number, but what scared me most was the possibility that they knew where I lived. The next day, we didn't hear anything further from the police, and none of us received any more messages from the unknown number, but the feeling of worry and unease never fully went away. The abandoned house, the strange man, and the threatening texts continued to haunt me, making sure I never dared to return to that area again. My story begins with distant memories from when I was a child, and we would often visit my grandparents during holidays, even though my family didn't live in the same town. These visits were usually full of joy and warmth. My grandparents lived in a quiet neighborhood, and just 2 houses down was my aunt's house. It was a small community where nearly everyone knew each other, but there was one house between my grandparents' house and my aunt's. A house that had long become the subject of hushed talks among the children in the family, and it wasn't a pleasant story. The woman who lived there was a terrifying figure in our eyes. She was tall, much larger than any woman I had ever seen, probably over 6 feet. Every time she appeared in the yard, we felt chills. She often wore dresses and large boots meant for heavy labor, along with a wooden chain around her neck. Sometimes we would catch her working in the back garden or scrubbing the exterior of her house. Her strange cleaning of the outside of her home always made us uncomfortable, as if she was trying to hide something. She would shout at us children, calling us crude and unpleasant names. Even more frightening, she often warned us that the devil would come for us if we didn't stay away from her. The adults in the family, including my parents, always told us not to pay attention to her and to stay away. Naturally, this only made us kids more scared and curious. Every time we had to walk from my grandparents' house to my aunt's, we would dash past her house, knowing full well that she would be watching us from the window, her eyes staring at every step we took. Those glances were enough to send chills down anyone's spine, so none of us ever dared to pass by alone. It was an unspoken rule among the children. Then one Halloween night, when all the kids in the family gathered at my grandparents' house to prepare for trick-or-treating, one of my cousins, Tommy, came up with a bold idea. He dared us to trick-or-treat at that woman's house. I remember the fear welling up inside me, but I didn't want to be labeled a coward. I knew if I refused, I would be teased endlessly. Besides, I wasn't going alone, we'd go together as a group. And with more people, the fear seemed to lessen slightly. We approached the house, my heart pounding. The kids were silent. No one spoke a word. Tommy, the bravest, went ahead and rang the doorbell. At first, nothing happened. I sighed in relief, thinking maybe she wasn't home. But then, suddenly, a series of loud bangs came from inside the house, like doors slamming repeatedly. When the door opened, there she was, but this time, she wasn't just standing there watching us. In her hand, she held a severed human head. I couldn't tell if it was real or just a Halloween prop, but in that moment, all of us screamed in terror. We ran as fast as we could back to my grandparents' house, hearts racing. The adults, after hearing what happened, just laughed and said we had bothered her and deserved a scare. They told us it was just a Halloween prank, and the head was surely a prop, but still. I couldn't shake the chilling feeling from seeing her hold that head, her cold, emotionless eyes staring at us. Things seemed to have ended after that night, but a month later, something horrific happened. It was late in the afternoon when my aunt, who lived just 2 houses away from the woman, was coming home from the grocery store. She had bags in one hand and my younger cousin in the other. As she was about to enter her house, the woman suddenly appeared behind her. She had a small wire saw, the kind used to cut trees, and crept up behind my aunt. From what my parents later told me, the woman looped the wire saw over my aunt's head and around her neck, then began pulling hard. My aunt panicked, but survival instincts kicked in, and she immediately turned, kicking the door hard enough to knock the woman off balance. As the noise erupted, my uncle who was inside rushed out and knocked the woman down with a fire poker. The police were called immediately. Upon further investigation, they uncovered a horrifying secret beneath the woman's house. Over the years, she had secretly dug an intricate network of tunnels underground. These tunnels not only extended beneath her home, but also reached under my aunt's, my grandparents', and another nearby house. Strangely, she had taken all the dirt from the tunnels and used it to create raised mounds in her backyard garden. But the most terrifying discovery was when the police found a strange underground shrine in the tunnel system. The shrine was filled with eerie symbols, and surrounding it were strange objects, including fake human heads like the one she had used to scare us on Halloween. Those heads looked incredibly real, but fortunately they were only props. My aunt survived the incident, but she carries a long scar on her neck, a permanent reminder of what happened. My family chose not to speak much about it in front of the children, but the event haunted me for years. Stories of the strange woman spread throughout the town, and no one dared go near her house again. After she was arrested, the woman was committed to a mental institution, and her house has been abandoned ever since. To this day, whenever I think back, I still get chills remembering that Halloween night. The banging, the image of the severed head, and her cold, lifeless eyes remain a haunting part of my childhood memories. This story I'm about to tell is one of the most terrifying memories from my childhood. Even though most people don't believe it when I tell them, I swear this actually happened. It's etched so deeply in my mind that I can never forget the intense fear I experienced that night. As a child, I loved weekends when my parents would let me stay up late. Weekends were the freest time for me, with no worries about school the next morning. I would sit up watching TV until late at night, only going to bed when I was too exhausted. My parents usually went to bed before me, leaving me alone in the living room, lounging on the sofa, eyes glued to the screen. I loved that feeling, absolute freedom, the house sinking into silence, and just me with my favorite shows. But one night, in the middle of that summer, something strange happened. It was a regular evening, and I was stretched out on the sofa, watching an old cartoon. My eyes began to droop, and I was almost asleep. Suddenly, a sound from outside woke me up. It was the creaking of the porch swing, moving strangely, as if someone was sitting on it, gently swinging back and forth. At first, I didn't pay much attention, thinking it was just the wind, but the sound didn't stop. Something felt very off, and I couldn't lie still any longer. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. Fear started creeping into my mind, but I couldn't resist the curiosity. I slowly got up from the sofa and walked toward the living room window. The large window had a direct view of our front porch, where our old swing sat. I tiptoed, peeking through the thin curtain, and when I saw what was outside, my heart nearly stopped. Sitting on the swing was an elderly woman, probably in her 50s. She wore a white nightgown stained with dirt and blood, her disheveled hair hanging down her face. But the most terrifying part was the large knife she held, the kind of kitchen knife my mum usually used. Her eyes were empty, vacant, yet gleamed with a kind of madness I couldn't explain. She sat there, rocking the swing steadily, as if nothing was wrong. But the blood covering her sent a chill down my spine. At that moment, I panicked. I didn't know what to do, but instinctively, I turned and ran toward my parents' room. I screamed, trying to explain what I had just seen, but the words caught in my throat, choked by fear. When I finally managed to say a few sentences, my father sat up, visibly annoyed. He thought I was just having a bad dream and dismissed everything I said. "Stop imagining things. Go back to bed," he said in a deep, stern voice. But I wouldn't give up. I cried, pleading with him, trying to convince him that something was really wrong. My father, now clearly fed up with me causing a scene in the middle of the night, finally decided to drag me to the front door to prove there was nothing outside. I didn't want to go. I kicked, screamed, and begged him to stop, but he still pulled me toward the door. As we got close, he unlocked it and pulled the door open, saying, "See, there's no one out here." But he didn't finish his sentence. I saw his face turn pale, his eyes widening in horror as he looked out onto the porch. The woman was still there, but this time, she wasn't just sitting. As the door opened, she slowly stood up, still gripping the knife tightly. She stared at us, her eyes dark and filled with insanity. My father immediately slammed the door shut, locking it, then yelled at my mum to call the police. I could see the tension in his face as he rushed to the bedroom to grab the 12-gauge shotgun he kept in the closet. He came back to the living room, cracked the door open just enough to point the barrel outside, and shouted at the woman, asking what she was doing on our porch. Her voice was raspy and weak, but I could still hear what she said clearly. "Someone killed my husband, but it wasn't me." That sentence hung in the still night air, making everything feel even more terrifying. My father, maintaining a calm voice, told her the police were on their way and advised her to leave. Suddenly, she panicked, gripped the knife tighter, and turned, running off the porch and disappearing into the darkness. The police arrived about 15 minutes later. They found the woman at a nearby house, trying to break into one of our neighbors' homes. She was arrested without any resistance, but the terrifying scene remained etched in my mind. That night, I learned an important lesson about how the most unexpected things can happen in the most ordinary moments. What made it even scarier was that after she was arrested, my dad called my uncle, who lived right next door, to warn him. My uncle, a tough man, had been waiting on his front porch with a shotgun in his hands. As the woman passed by, he simply said, "Keep walking, you lunatic." I can never forget that night. Neither can my family. My parents never mentioned the event again, as if they wanted to bury the memory deep in the past. But for me, every time I see that porch swing, I remember that fateful night. I never sleep in the living room anymore, and I never sit on the sofa late at night by myself. And whenever I hear the creaking of the swing in the wind, I can't help but think of that woman, ghost of madness who briefly stepped into our lives, even if only for a moment.